Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling some pretty heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah,
Global events, grabbing all the headlines.
definitely.
We've got excerpts from Texto Calado and some really insightful commentary from Professor Arau Alves.
Always insightful.
So get ready to explore the Russia-Ukraine conflict, power shifts on the world stage, even echoes of history-shaping events today. You ready to dive in?
Absolutely, Professor Elves. He doesn't hold back. He connects these seemingly separate events and highlights how interconnected everything truly is in today's world.
All right, so let's start with what's happening in Ukraine. Professor Alves points out this unsettling trend of Russia using a massive number of what are called guided bombs, over 51,000 since the conflict began,
Wow.
with a huge spike just this year. What struck me is that these aren't your average bombs, right?
Exactly. Imagine taking older bombs, maybe even from the Soviet era, and giving them a serious upgrade. These guided bombs are fitted with wings and satellite navigation, making them incredibly accurate and able to hit targets much farther away. We're talking about the ability to penetrate even the toughest Ukrainian defenses, especially in the eastern regions.
That's heavy stuff, and it makes the recent attack in Zaporizhzhia all the more devastating. Professor Alves calls it the deadliest of the year. 13 deaths, 113 injured. It really highlights the human cost of this conflict and raises questions about what this escalation means. Is Russia shifting tactics? Are they becoming even more determined to achieve their objectives?
It does seem like a strategic shift, and if Ukraine wants to counter this, they're going to need even stronger defenses. Professor Alves points out that they heavily rely on Western support for sophisticated air defense systems to target those Russian aircraft and airfields.
But even with all the international attention and support, it sounds like they're having a tough time neutralizing this threat. I wonder if this is a sign of things to come, if the conflict could escalate even further. What are your thoughts on that?
It's definitely a concern. Professor Alves' analysis points towards a possible pattern of escalating aggression from Russia. The question is, how will the rest of the world respond? And what does it mean for the future of this conflict?
Speaking of global responses, Professor Alves also dives into the implications of Donald Trump's return to the U.S. presidency. Specifically, he's looking at Trump's stance on Greenland, which he sees as a potential flashpoint for global power dynamics. This is where things get really interesting for me, because it seems like history is repeating itself in a way. Wasn't Trump interested in purchasing Greenland a few years back?
You're right, he was. Back in 2019, it seemed more like a passing interest. But now the justification seems to be centered around national security and countering Russian and Chinese influence in the Arctic. It's a different tone, and potentially more aggressive.
I remember hearing about how strategically important Greenland is, but I could use a refresher. Why all the attention on this island? What makes it so crucial on the world stage?
Well, for starters, its location is key. Greenland sits right on major Arctic shipping routes and is close to paths used by Russian submarines. It's also incredibly important for U.S. missile defense and space surveillance. Plus, you have the U.S. military already present in Greenland at Thule Air Base. As the Arctic opens up due to climate change and these geopolitical tensions rise, Greenland's significance just keeps growing.
Professor Alves suggests that Trump might even consider using military or economic force to annex Greenland. That's a bold claim. And it makes me wonder what that would mean for the relationship between the U.S. and Denmark, which currently controls Greenland. And what about Greenland's own push for independence?
It's definitely a complex situation with a lot of moving parts. What's fascinating is how Denmark is reacting. They're stepping up their game, investing more in defense and surveillance in Greenland to solidify their presence. It's like they're trying to assert their sovereignty in the face of these new challenges.
But I imagine there are different opinions within Greenland itself. Some people might welcome a stronger U.S. military presence, especially if it means more security for an independent Greenland. Others might be wary of outside influence, whether it's from the U.S. or Denmark. It sounds like a tough situation for them to navigate.
Absolutely. It really highlights how these global power dynamics play out on a smaller scale, impacting real people and their desire for self-determination. And the Arctic is a prime example of this tug of war, with resources, shipping routes, and strategic positioning all up for grabs.
Now, shifting gears a bit to another tense situation. Professor Alves brings up a potential energy conflict brewing between Slovakia and Ukraine. This one caught my eye because it involves a decision by Ukraine to stop the transit of Russian gas through its territory, and Slovakia is not happy about it. Why is that such a big deal for them?
Well, it's a bit of a domino effect. Slovakia relies on that Russian gas that transits through Ukraine, and they're worried about the economic impact of this decision. They're talking about taking drastic measures, cutting emergency electricity supplies to Ukraine, reducing refugee aid, and potentially using their veto power to block EU decisions that benefit Ukraine. What stands out to you about this situation? Does anything surprise you?
Honestly, I'm a bit taken aback by how far Slovakia seems willing to go, and it makes you realize just how interconnected these countries are, even in the midst of a conflict like this. What are Slovakia's motivations here? Is it purely about economics, or is there more to it?
It's definitely complex. Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, has said he's concerned about higher energy prices for the entire EU, which could hurt their competitiveness. But under Fico's leadership, Slovakia has also been getting closer to Russia and has refused to provide military aid to Ukraine. So there's a political dimension to this as well, which adds another layer of complexity.
All right, so it's not just about the gas itself. It's about where Slovakia stands in this larger geopolitical game. Do we know how Ukraine is responding to all this? Or are they trying to find a solution with Slovakia?
There hasn't been much of a public response from Ukraine's Ministry of Energy yet, but there are talks of creating a joint working group to address the situation. The problem is this has the potential to escalate quickly, especially with Slovakia threatening to use its veto power in the EU. It could create even more division within Europe, which is the last thing they need when facing Russian aggression.
It really makes you think about the ripple effect of these decisions. What seems like a regional energy dispute could actually have far-reaching consequences for the whole of Europe.
Absolutely, and it highlights how energy, politics, and economics are all intertwined. What happens in one area can impact countries and people miles away.
It's a stark reminder that in our globalized world, even events that seem isolated can have global implications.
And it brings to light the tough choices countries face when trying to balance their own interests with their commitments to international alliances.
Speaking of tough choices, Professor Alves also touches on a rather sensitive diplomatic situation. He discusses the Polish president's request to guarantee safe passage for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to attend the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz.
This is where the weight of history really comes into play. It's a significant anniversary, marking a pivotal moment in human history, a stark reminder of the horrors of the Holocaust.
Absolutely. But there's a complication. The International Criminal Court has issued a warrant for Netanyahu's arrest, accusing him of war crimes and crimes against humanity related to the Gaza conflict.
And this creates a potential diplomatic minefield. The Polish president is from a right-wing nationalist party, while the current government is centrist and pro-European Union. There's already tension between them, and this situation could exacerbate it.
Not to mention the sensitivity surrounding the Auschwitz anniversary itself. It's a deeply emotional event. And the presence of Netanyahu, with these charges hanging over him, could overshadow the commemoration.
It's a delicate balancing act. On one hand, you have the Polish president's desire to honor the relationship with Israel and recognize the importance of this anniversary. On the other hand, you have the ICC warrant and the potential for international backlash if Netanyahu is granted immunity.
And then there's Netanyahu's own position. He hasn't confirmed whether he'll even attend, though he has been present at previous Auschwitz ceremonies.
It's a complex situation with no easy answers, and it raises important questions about accountability, justice, and the legacy of historical trauma.
Professor Alves, through his commentary, really emphasizes the importance of remembrance, particularly when it comes to events like the Holocaust. It's a reminder that we can't allow ourselves to forget the atrocities of the past, lest we repeat them.
And that remembrance is crucial. Auschwitz serves as a symbol of the immense human cost of hatred, prejudice, and intolerance. It's a call to action, urging us to confront these forces wherever they may arise.
It's a sobering thought, but one that's essential to grapple with, especially as we navigate these turbulent times.
Yeah, it really does make you think.
It can feel overwhelming at times, all these interconnected global events unfolding. But his analysis gives us a framework to understand them, to look beyond the headlines and dig deeper.
And that's the key, isn't it? To engage in thoughtful dialogue, question our assumptions, and really try to make sense of it all.
Exactly. That's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive. Equipping our listeners with a knowledge and different viewpoints to navigate this complex world we live in.
Speaking of different viewpoints, I'm curious to get your take on something. We've talked about the conflict in Ukraine, the tension surrounding Greenland, the energy dispute between Slovakia and Ukraine, even the delicate situation surrounding the Auschwitz anniversary. Professor Alves presents these as separate events, but do you see any connections between them?
That's a great question. Now that you mention it, There are definitely some threads running through all of them. Each situation highlights this idea of shifting alliances, of countries reassessing their priorities and allegiances in a rapidly changing world.
I think you're onto something there. The conflict in Ukraine has forced countries to choose sides, or at least reassess their relationships with Russia. And then you have Greenland, where Denmark is trying to strengthen its hold, as other powers like the US, Russia, and China show increasing interest in the region. It's like a global game of chess, with everyone repositioning their pieces.
In the energy dispute between Slovakia and Ukraine is another example of how these shifting alliances are playing out in unexpected ways.
Yeah.
You have Slovakia, a member of the EU and NATO, potentially siding with Russia economically, even as they condemn the invasion of Ukraine. It shows how complex these relationships can be and how national interests often clash with international commitments.
It's a fascinating case study in the realpolitik of the 21st century. And then you bring in the historical dimension. With the Auschwitz anniversary, it serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked nationalism and aggression. It makes you wonder if we've truly learned from the mistakes of the past, or if we're destined to repeat them in new and terrifying ways.
That's a sobering thought. And it connects to the theme of interconnectedness that you mentioned earlier. We can't view these events in isolation. They're all part of a larger web of global dynamics. What happens in one part of the world inevitably impacts other parts, even in seemingly unrelated ways.
Exactly. It's like a butterfly effect. A decision made in one capital can trigger a chain of events. That ultimately leads to conflict or cooperation thousands of miles away.
And that brings us back to the importance of critical thinking and informed dialogue. We can't afford to be passive observers. We need to understand these complexities, challenge our own assumptions, and engage in constructive conversations about the future we want to create.
I couldn't agree more, and I think Professor Alves would be pleased to know that his work is sparking these kinds of discussions. He's not just presenting information, he's prompting us to think critically and question the status quo.
And that's what makes his analysis so valuable. He's not giving us all the answers, but he's giving us the tools to find them ourselves.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a challenge. Don't just accept what you hear or read at face value. Dig deeper. Ask questions and consider multiple perspectives.
It's about connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture, and understanding how these global events impact your own life and the world around you.
Because in the end, we're all part of this interconnected web, and our choices have consequences.
So what will your choices be? It really is something to think about, isn't it? It's easy to just tune it all out sometimes.
It is.
But as we've seen today, what happens on the other side of the world can really hit close to home. Like with that energy dispute between Slovakia and Ukraine.
Right.
On the surface, it seems like a regional thing.
Yeah.
But it actually exposes those vulnerabilities in the global energy market.
Yeah.
And raises questions about how unified Europe really is when facing that pressure from Russia. It shows how much power just one leader can have to really impact things on a global scale. Like if Slovakia cuts off that aid to Ukraine and sides with Russia economically, what message does that send to other countries? Could that embolden Russia or even cause a rift in the EU?
It's a big question.
These are the big questions we need to be asking ourselves.
I agree.
And it all comes back to Professor Alves and his analysis. He's not giving us those easy answers.
No, he's not.
But he gives us that framework to really wrap our heads around these issues. And he challenges us to think critically about all that information that's coming at us every day.
That's so important these days.
It's like he's our guide through these geopolitical forests or something, pointing out those landmarks along the way.
Yeah.
But we have to do the exploring ourselves, draw our own conclusions.
I like that analogy.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Professor Alves' commentary today, I encourage you to keep diving in. Don't let the conversation end here. Read more. Talk to people who see things differently. And most importantly, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah, ask those tough questions.
Because the more we understand these complexities, the better we'll be able to face those challenges and those opportunities that are coming our way.
And who knows, you might even find something Professor Alves missed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning.